Welcome back, listeners. It is Monday, which means we have a new episode for you today. I'm Andy Alexander, and joining me here today is
Dan Gorman from the University of Rochester.
Thanks so much for joining me. Now, today you have an interview for us where you chatted with Dr. Chris Cantwell and Dr. Kristian Petersen. Can you tell us a little bit about that interview?
Yes, we had a conversation about their new edited volume, Digital Humanities and Research Methods in Religious Studies, which DeGruyter published earlier this year. The volume is a collection of case studies looking at not so much the nuts and bolts of digital humanities, but rather how digital research methods can be useful to the field of religion. So it's a spotlight on 16 or so projects that have made use of computational methods, digital publishing, and how those were beneficial to the scholars' larger research projects.
That sounds really fascinating. And it seems like a really productive book, I think, for our field, because we see so much digital humanities work starting to happen in a variety of religious studies programs. So I'm really excited to hear this interview.
This is the Religious Studies Project, Daniel Gorman, reporting from Rochester, New York. And today I'm speaking to editors Christopher Cantwell and Kristian Petersen about their new volume, Digital Humanities and Research Methods in Religious Studies from DeGruyter. Christopher Cantwell is a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and Kristian Petersen is a professor at Old Dominion University. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me this morning.
Thanks for having us.
Tell me, first of all, what is the purpose of this book? You say in the introduction that you wanted to get people thinking about questions of ethics and what counts or not in religious studies. What was your intention in producing this project?
I'll start with that one if it's okay, Chris. So the volume that we produced is part of a larger series with DeGruyter that I'm also on the editorial board for, called Introductions to Digital Humanities Religion. And the series more broadly, and then I think what we tried to do more specifically is encourage people to take on digital methods and digital tools to enhance the study of religion. So think about how these things that perhaps people are unfamiliar with or have heard about but are unsure of their purpose or function, to try to expose them to why these methods, why these tools can help us yield new answers, think about our subjects in interesting ways. We titled our introduction, Digital Humanities and Religious Studies, a why-to guide, because I think this gets at really the core of what we were hoping to do is not necessarily show people how to use this digital tool or go through the ins and outs of a particular method, but rather help people think about why digital tools and digital methods might enhance their work. And we tried to do that in our volume by letting people kind of get into the nitty-gritty of case studies, examples of digital humanist work in religion that we thought was really great. So that was kind of how we tackled it in our volume. And some of the other volumes do this differently. Some of them do get into a little bit more of the ins and outs of a how-to. But we were trying to be more, it sounds corny, inspirational or motivational in the sense that perhaps you've heard about digital humanities, maybe you're a little curious. Here are some ways that people have done this successfully that you can also perhaps be inspired by.
Yeah, and if I could build on what Kristian was saying, I think the title of our introduction is key. And I think another thing that's helpful to think about the nature of the structure of the book is to put it within sort of the longer history of digital humanities more broadly, because digital scholarship has been around for going on 20 years now, but a lot of other fields were sort of quicker to adapt it than I would say the study of religion might have been. The American Historical Association and the Modern Language Association in particular were early advocates for the peer review of digital scholarship, counting it in 10-year promotion. hosting workshops. And so, Kristian and I, as sort of, folks who circle within the study of religion, sort of were wondering why these conversations weren't happening in our circles as well. And so we saw this as hopefully serving as a catalyst. And thankfully by the time it came out, as the table of contents show, there is a kind of a robust ecology of digital scholarship in the study of religion right now.
Yeah, one thing I was thinking about, particularly in the discussions of projects that deal with space and mapping religion, that in particular seems to be a growth area. Projects like Arch City Religion, Boston's Hidden Religious Spaces, that one in particular seems particularly salient for people. What are your thoughts on that? Why do you think so many people are interested in the potential of digital mapping technology for religion?
I mean, for me, I'll venture a guess. I think there are ways in which we are inhabiting a spatial turn right now, right? Like we all have a global map on our smartphone or tablet that we didn't have, 5, 10, 15 years ago. And so I think we just recognize our relationship to space socially in ways that we perhaps hadn't before. But I think another thing that's important to consider is also just the ease and access to that kind of software, right? That there's a growing suite of tools that allows for, folks who didn't major in computer science or know a coding language can now do this kind of work, which is why we think it's important to, call attention to the availability of these. I think, the Boston project you mentioned is done in part with undergraduate students. So it becomes a pedagogical tool as much as it's a research tool. And that's, I think, one of the real powers of digital scholarship is that it blurs the boundaries and where, scholars in the study of religion used to have these discrete fields of teaching and research and service. Digital scholarship allows those things to be all things at once.
Yeah, and I that last point I think is very helpful in thinking about two projects that we highlight in the book. One is led by Caleb Elfenbein, on mapping Islamophobia, and this project, part of what I think the mapping part of it helped people understand was the real magnitude of this. It helped kind of communicate the data that he was collecting in really powerful ways that perhaps writing, there's been, hundreds of anti-Muslim, sentiment or hate acts or these kind of things. It just kind of hits in a different way. But this was a project that he worked on with many of his students at Grinnell. And so some of his students, Farah Bakari and Julia Schaefer, they've continued with this work in other realms as they've gone on to graduate school. The other project that kind of incorporates both this model was the one on China, which was led by Fenggang Yang. And at the time, Jonathan Pettit, who's now a professor at the University of Hawaii, they were collaborating as graduate student and professor to kind of map religious institutions in China. So I think it's a good point, because this is one of the things we try to point out in the introduction, is that one of the great things about digital humanities work is this kind of collaborative nature. It really is most successful when you have lots of people involved, and that means lots of researchers. So that could be graduate students, even undergrads, and professors, of course. But then also, people can use a Google Map to do a digital project. But you can also then collaborate with people who are experts in the technology themselves. So a lot of projects that we highlight in the book are working with librarians, archivists, computer scientists, along with humanities scholars. And this is where I think some of the really exciting work is going to happen, is when you get these kind of collectives of folks that are bringing their various expertise into a single project and really kind of making it come together in a unique way.
Yeah, I've experienced that in my own work. I mean, here at the University of Rochester, there's a number of digital humanities projects, and they do tend to be all hands on deck. Like I know how to bumble around on WordPress, and I made some HTML once, but I can't do the more heavy lifting of database stuff, but if there's somebody over in CS, particularly, an undergrad who needs like a co-op credit or something, there's a way that it can, be mutually advantageous. I think that team effort is very interesting, which then ties into another point in your introduction where you mentioned thinking about the ethics of the project, or whatever project you're building, how to structure it. There's the matter of credit, making sure everyone gets adequate credit. And sometimes you wind up with a humanities project that looks more like a science paper if there's 30 contributors listed. Can you speak a little bit about this issue of credits and making religious studies digital work count towards your career?
Yeah, sure. I could venture a start to this conversation, which should have many voices. Yeah, I mean, I think there's for a long time, I think the humanities has conflated what scholarship looks like with what the printed word looks like. And so that knowledge can only look like the printed word. And what we've seen with the rise of new media is, of course, we now have a plethora of genres of knowledge production. And there has been, it's closing, thankfully, but a disconnect between sort of what counts and what's produced. And one of the things I think the project and the volume does is, by laying out the panoply of different kinds of scholarly work that people are doing and identifying them and calling them scholarship, is a way of, I think, normalizing, recognizing and accounting these kinds of work in the field. Because oftentimes they're celebrated. Projects can be award-winning, projects can get grant funding, and then the sort of last hurdle is when, where do they fit within individuals' tenure portfolios? Do they go in the teaching side? Do they go in the research side? Do they go in the service side? When in fact they go in all three. And so how to sort of measure the weight of that has been the challenge, which is why I was incredibly grateful to work with Kristian again, as well as a number of other scholars with the American Academy of Religion, and drafting guidelines for counting digital scholarship in promotion and tenure files, which I have since heard from multiple people. Folks have celebrated as being the most comprehensive and incisive and helpful sort of guides for scholars looking to have that work count.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, especially for grad students who, I mean, historically can feel like in uncredited labor at points. And so I think the transparency of the internet, I think it's cool to actually expose some of the inner workings of a big research project, and that there are multiple cooks in the kitchen.
One other thing that I want to just add is it's kind of a double-edged sword in a way, doing this type of work in particular institutional context. So, COVID, I think, has magnified the instability of the academic job market, which was already pretty terrible. So perhaps digital humanities is a way to kind of think about scholarship outside of the traditional ways we thought about what does a postgraduate career look like. And Chris is actually a great example of this. He's done lots of really cool stuff, both being a traditional professor in a sense, but also being a public historian in many contexts, where his work is getting many more eyes than anything that I've done. So there is that, which I think is exciting. It's an exciting opportunity about digital humanities work. But if you are in a kind of more traditional context, this idea of does it count can work against you. And I think this can be also related to the issues of like public scholarship more generally. So even doing podcasts like this, doing public writing, sometimes peers don't see this as kind of quote unquote serious work. So depending on the context, depending on your colleagues, they might not value this type of work. So one of the things that might happen is this almost becomes like an add-on. So you need to do the peer-reviewed articles, you need to do the university press book, and then you can also do this other type of work that for some people in your institution, if that's the context you're in, they might not value it.
They look at it as a hobby, basically.
Yeah, they look at it as a hobby. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. So it's a very, depending on the project, it's a very labor heavy hobby, and maybe not always the most fun hobby, but I think in general, it's really rewarding work. One of the kind of my toe in the water of digital humanities is something that I put together called the Women of Islamic Studies database, which is a crowdsourced resource for trying to dissolve the disproportionate, gender dynamic in things like, conference panels, edited volumes, syllabi, citations, by trying to draw attention to scholars in Islamic studies who are women and often ignored in those contexts. And I mean, that might be the thing that people get most excited about, that I hear the most, like, this is great, that people actually like use it. When people are going on sabbatical, they'll like put it in their email signature and say, if you're looking for someone to do something, check this database. So it can be really, really rewarding work on other levels, even though it might not be rewarded in some sort of institutional way in terms of tenure, promotion, or those kind of things, if that's the context you're working in.
Yeah, if I could continue to add to this conversation, because I do think it's really important, because I think, Kristian's absolutely right. And I think part of what he's saying is an eternal truth that one has to be really thoughtful and strategic about the kind of research they do and what forms that research takes. I don't think that's ever changed. That's been true of scholars and academics for a century. To your point, Dan, I think what's really true is that, as you said earlier, like, we're all digital humanists now, right? Like, we are conducting this interview over Zoom. When we start a research project, we usually turn to Google and then our university catalogs, right? Like, there are multiple ways in which our work has become mediated by digital technology. And even if you don't see yourself learning text mining, GIS software, natural language processing, those kind of things, like, you are a digital humanist, right? Unless you are writing in pen and pencil and only looking at material artifacts, your work is mediated by digital culture. And being aware of that is vital no matter where you end up. And so I think some familiarity with, it's incumbent upon everyone, I think, to gain some familiarity with the ways in which, knowledge about religion is produced and shared and critiqued today. And that, regardless of where you find yourself. And then to one other point, I think, and again, another turn to what Kristian said, which again, I totally agree with, is in my experience, you mentioned the graduate student experience, Dan, and I think what's really true is that oftentimes there's a difference between what will help you get a job and what will help you keep a job, right? So I was in the museum world for a long time, and a lot of the interest I received from academic appointments was based on my museum work. Now that I've returned to the academy, I have had to greatly scale down the amount of digital work I've done in order to produce the kind of scholarly products that look recognizable to my peers. And again, that's a strategy, that's a choice, that's a method that's going to be true in any environment.
Yeah, it reminds me also that with this book, you're mapping the terrain, as you say on page 9 of the introduction. Nice shout out to Jonathan Z. Smith there. But also, you're making an argument for why the work matters. And I think that has to be inherently political because of the questions it poses about what counts as traditional work, who counts, whose name is above the byline. So I think in a way, digital studies has to be political because it involves, changing what the normal scholarly output looks like.
Yeah, and I'll say this is one of the things I get most excited about in integrating digital methods into the study of religion is it allows sort of two things that I think really animate my own work. One, it oftentimes allows our scholarship to look like the communities and people that we study, right? So an example I really think about that's not in the volume actually, but it comes to mind is the American Religious Sounds Project, which looks at is building an archive of the sonic landscape of American religion, as that's the way in which people often encounter it, right? Like, we lose the depth of the texture in that, in just so, in only allowing print. Secondly, the other thing I really, that I feel really drawn to is the ways in which digital scholarship allows us to make the communities and people we study to be partners in the production of knowledge rather than our objects of study, right? And so this is something that I do here in Milwaukee is I maintain a project called Gathering Places, where a team of students and I partner with places of worship throughout the city and work with them to write their history, the history of their institution or their community in Milwaukee, and then we map that. So we're trying to build a living spatial archive of religious diversity in Milwaukee, and the digital medium has really drawn a lot of communities in that it allows them to say, oh, hey, we can have our story showcased. We have recordings of activities of significance. We have scans of old photos that can be shared with the world, and with future generations of our own community. And so that kind of, you're right, it is intrinsically political, and it allows you to draw out those. Like Kristian was talking earlier about how some of the projects in the book have used space to make visible what's invisible, right? By sort of highlighting flashpoints and heat points and things like that. And what I have found really powerful in mapping is the way it creates a kind of visual level playing field, right? That everybody occupies a space, and it makes the religious diversity of Milwaukee, creates a kind of, equity and parity that oftentimes doesn't get seen out in the wider culture.
One other thing that comes to mind is a comment from Marcus Bingenheimer's chapter on digital tools for Buddhist studies. He writes that there's a challenge of citing digital editions, is that if you're producing new content for the web, and so this I think could be true whether it's, again, the mapping collection you're producing or a new digital edition of a text, is that it only exists in a digital format typically. And then trying to figure out a systematic way to cite that and make that, again, appear in other people's scholarship. You also say in your introduction, there's the matter of sustainability, which I think goes right hand in hand with citing something, making sure that it's going to stick around long enough that it can be cited. What do you think are some of the challenges of citing and preserving digital scholarship to make sure it will be there, as a footnotable resource for people 10 years, 15 years from now?
There's, I think, a few intersecting things happening in your question here. And yeah, Marcus's essay shows how these things change and are malleable over time very clearly. Some of the other essays do this as well. But for us, I think what we were trying to communicate to people who might think about doing this is, when you're thinking about a project, you do have to think about it in a different way, in the sense that traditional scholarship, you think, okay, I'm going to work on this, I'm going to do the research, I'm going to write it up, I'm going to get it peer reviewed, and then it's published, and then it's done. And most DH projects don't do that, or maybe not most of them, but many of them are ongoing. And even if they have kind of an end of life in terms of when you're updating and these kind of things, you do have to think about how is this going to work in a year, in 5 years, or beyond that. And of course, we all know how things change on the internet very quickly. But these I think go hand in hand. So you have to think about your project as ongoing work, and one that you're returning to in new ways. And this idea of collaboration also helps that, where you get new energy perhaps, or new perspectives. And then thinking about how are we going to preserve this? So that might require funding for some projects. So some of the larger projects that are highlighted in the book, have institutional funding from, Ivy League universities. Others have large grants from the NEH. But some of them were, kind of do-it-yourself type projects as well. And when you're thinking about sustainability, you don't necessarily need to have the big bank behind it. But you do have to think about ways of keeping that project moving forward. That way people can access it. And then hopefully, people will start to, cite it and acknowledge it in ways that are discussing the way that the project might be challenging or disrupting kind of traditional norms in that subject.
Yeah, I think to that point as well, I think sustainability is absolutely key, and there needs to be at the start of a project a conversation about how it's going to be sustainable. But another thing I think it's important to emphasize is, in conversations I've had with folks about the undertaking of digital work, is some folks are hesitant because their understanding of what a digital project is just a lifetime of curation, right? Like, I launched this project and now I've got to maintain that project for the rest of my life. And that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. In the same way, there are multiple genres of writing, from the monograph to the article to the op-ed and the essay and things like that, that these digital projects can take on a lot of different forms. And one of the things we really try to showcase in the book is the different levels of commitment and scale one could take on with digital scholarship, and then the questions of sustainability that go along with that, right? So I think about something like, Heidi Campbell's work in building the Network for New Media, Religion, and Digital Culture Studies out at Texas A&M, which is a long-term, basically building a social network for scholars, is what Heidi is trying to do. And that requires, ongoing maintenance and planning. But then by contrast, we have another essay by Abhishek Amar from Hamilton College, which is seeking out to map, create 3D renderings of Hindu temples in India. And then once those maps are made, there are going to be teaching tools and research tools, but, he's not interested in then, continually iteratively adding to this, building upon it. He has a kind of a more contained project in mind, and they're both equally valuable, in my opinion.
This hits home for me because I worked on a project called Digitizing Rochester's Religions, which actually sounds a good bit like your Gathering Spaces project, Christopher. Pairing with local institutions, preserving their documents, sharing their story. But when the PI moved to a new university, so no longer access to the funds, and then I was able to use some professional funds to sort of dump everything we had so far on the internet. But I'm still thinking about how to preserve it. I mean, right now I can keep it up on my university digital scholarship platform account. But when I graduate, that's going to be sunsetted. And I understand the university doesn't want to save 80 gigabytes or whatever of this stuff forever. So when that happens, I'm going to have to figure out where to stow it. And I have tried saving pages in the Internet Archive, but the Internet Archive doesn't capture everything. Doesn't capture videos. Maps can be very clunky if they even are captured at all. So yeah, it's an ongoing issue. I mean, I'm just very glad to work on the project, and I learned a lot, but now I kind of feel like, and also because it was community embedded, like I owe something to the people, who contributed and shared their, literally opened their closets full of old documents. And, there is a responsibility that comes with it. You're like the custodian of these materials.
And sometimes the answer to those questions don't have to be individual, but they can be institutional and organizational, right? So that, I have found oftentimes the most helpful patrons in the production of scholarship are university libraries. Like they, in my opinion, are the future of the university, that they are going to serve the role as publisher, as repository, as producer of knowledge, as in ways they hadn't before because of the rise of digital media. But also, we can see organizations that have stood up, stepped into the breach to serve as a resource for individuals doing digital work. So the rise of institutional repositories, right? The Modern Language Association maintains an institutional repository where members can store scholarly work if they don't have the funding at their local smaller institutions. So there are ways in which people are doing this work, can envision an ecology and an architecture that works to promote it. And that's one of the things that we hope comes out of this project is, greater interest and awareness in doing something like that.
Yeah, and just to add on to or kind of give a sneak peek off of Chris's comment, the one of the forthcoming volumes we have in the DeGruyter series is Digital Humanities and Libraries and Archives in Religious Studies, which is edited by Clifford Anderson, who is one of the leaders in this field. So that's going to show the role of archivists, librarians, and how they kind of intersect with us as scholars and researchers as well. So
I think one note on which to end end this conversation, I noticed. So one of the contributors to your volume is Heidi Campbell, who in 2013 edited the volume Digital Religion: Understanding Religious Practice in New Media Worlds. And it was interesting thinking about that book, Campbell's book, in comparison to yours, because Campbell was talking about religious life on the internet. This book is about using the internet to study religious life, whether or not it's on the internet or not. Do you think digital humanities, most of the volumes in this book are most of the essays in this book are talking about using the internet to study offline religious activity. Do you think there is a way that we can wind up fully digital here, using digital humanities tools to study things that happen just on the internet, where it's this closed ecosystem of, electronic activity?
yeah, sure. I think there's a lot of great scholarship that's looking at digital communities, digital religion, and for me, one of the things that's kind of embedded in your question is, we don't try to define very clearly what digital humanities is. In the volume, I don't think either of us would try to do that now either. In kind of scholarship on digital humanities more broadly, that's a contested question. And so for some people, studying digital religions through a humanities perspective is digital humanities enough. For others, they might say, well, you need to use digital tools and digital methods to think about religion, whether it be online or off, to qualify as digital humanities. So I'm not one to play police. So I think both of those approaches are valid and useful. But there's certainly lots of great scholarship on things like digital ethnography and Facebook groups or things like that. There's a lot of great scholarship on online ritual. So there's lots of ways to kind of have digital humanities and digital religion intersect in really interesting ways, I think.
Yeah, that's an interesting comparison. From my perspective, I would see these two volumes as being interlocutors, right? Or maybe either sides of a spectrum where, our focus really was on research methods, right? And by the focus on method, you're going to be looking at the back end of the production of a product. Whereas Heidi's volume is the scholarly product that's produced, right? So it is the actual ethnography. But to Kristian's point as well, I have a similarly expansive definition of this work whereby, to me, the digital humanities is using digital technology to advance the work of the humanities or the application of humanistic theory to digital technology. And it's all, to me, a part of the same engagement with this digital mediated moment we now live in. Back to your original point about, we're all digital humanists now, and it's really just kind of up to everybody to find their place within it.
Well, thank you very much for your time. The book is Digital Humanities and Research Methods in Religious Studies, out now. And assuming these vaccines hold up, may we all have a little bit more of analog studies in our lives.
Yes, and be able to meet together. Thanks.
Yes.
Yes. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Dan, for this great interview. And thanks so much to Chris Cantwell and Kristian Petersen for taking the time to chat with us today. This has been a very fascinating discussion about the relevance of digital humanities research methods in the academic study of religion. And I think, as it's clear from today's episode, there are a number of ways that scholars can incorporate digital methods into the classroom and that students can engage in digital projects as part of a religious studies course or degree. Thanks so much to our wonderful listeners for tuning in today. We would absolutely love to hear your thoughts on the podcast. Please head over to Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram to let us know what you thought. Ask your questions. All of our folks today are on social media, and I'm sure they would be more than happy to continue the conversation there. Also, head over to our website at religiousstudiesproject.com for more information about this episode and a transcript of this episode as well. As we're rolling into this midpoint of the semester, we're all probably making a few extra cups of coffee a day, whether it's grading or writing midterms, participating in service work. And I just want to highlight the great work of this team here at the RSP, who tackle a variety of tasks in addition to their other work. So we appreciate any support that you can give, whether it's a one-time donation at PayPal or signing up for a monthly donation of as little as $1 at patreon.com/projectrs. That donation goes a long way in supporting the Religious Studies Project. We also have Amazon affiliate links, so when you're stocking up on coffee pods, please use our Amazon affiliate links. It won't change the price of your purchase, but a small portion of that will be donated to us here at the RSP. So think of it as just giving us a cup of coffee as well. And until next time, all that's left to say is thanks for listening.
The RSP is sponsored by the BASR, NAASR, and the IAHR, and is produced by the Religious Studies Project Association, a Scottish charitable incorporated organisation. Find out more at religiousstudiesproject.com.
Brought to you by editors Andy Alexander and David McConaughey and founding editors Chris Cotter and David Robertson. Our features are edited by Savannah Finver and our Opportunities Digest by Ella Bach. Audio editing by Alex Matthews, video editing by Alison Isidore, podcast transcription by Jayden Bartashius, and social media managed by Candice Mixon.
Don't forget, you can support the project by using our amazon.com, .co.uk and .ca links, or donating at patreon.com/projectrs. And you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, iTunes, and all other portals. Thanks for listening.